Apples of Gold presents a radio adaptation of The Meanest Man in the World, a farce whose only goal is to make you smile.
My father, thank heavens, is not typical of the rest of the human race. My father, in case you don't know this, is a very successful lawyer. He's the Clark of Montgomery and Clark of 25 Broad Street, New York City, and he attributes his success to the fact that he is not typical of the rest of the human race. My father, to say the least, has a cynical turn of mind. My father always says,
"Nice guys don't win ball games."
let's see, what else does my father always say? Oh, yes, kind hearts. What is your attitude in reference to kind hearts, Dad?
The road to failure is paved with kind hearts.
And?
This is a dog-eat-dog world.
And?
The good die young.
And if they don't die young, what is they certainly don't do, Dad?
They certainly don't win ball games.
That's my dad. The first day I went to work for my father was the day before Christmas, 1949. It was 8 o'clock in the morning, and my father was briefing me on my first case.
Here are the papers, George. Put them in your briefcase. This is your first case, and it's a simple assignment. It's a mortgage foreclosure.
A mortgage foreclosure?
George, boy, I hope the term isn't absolutely alien to you.
No, it's just that it's the day before Christmas, Dad, and it seems like a very strange day to foreclose mortgages on.
Really?
Well, I mean, why destroy this poor man's Christmas Eve? I mean,
It's a woman, Mrs. Jane Hudson.
well, she's probably decorating for Christmas and her Christmas tree, and it seems kind of unnecessarily mean. It's I'm sorry I interrupted you, Dad. What were you saying?
You don't happen to know this woman, do you, George?
No, I just feel sorry for her.
Well, that's very Christian of you, boy, but it's not exactly a very plausible attitude to take under the circumstances, is it?
I guess not, Dad.
As you see here, this particular mortgage has a post-action date on January 6th, 1950. Do you know what a post-action date is?
Yes, of course. A post-action date.
It means if we don't serve the foreclosure papers before January 6th, we forfeit all of our rights to this land.
Yes, I know that, Dad.
And so you see that under the circumstances, we can regard Christmas as nothing more than a legal holiday.
Shakespeare says the quality of mercy is not strained. It falleth as the
Shakespeare, George, is not one of our clients.
Yes, of course, Dad.
And Montgomery and Clark are not the American Red Cross. You are not Florence Nightingale. Our clients expect us to foreclose their mortgages for them. And in the offices of Montgomery and Clark, that means it shall be done.
Yes, Dad.
George, it's all very well to talk about mercy and goodwill to men, but the only goodwill anybody ever gave me, I paid for with very hard cash. And the only people who talk about mercy are the people who want it. And I think you will find after a few years of practicing law that Christmas is nothing but a legal holiday, and that Portia in The Merchant of Venice was really a very sheltered young lady.
Yes, Dad.
George, the road to failure is paved with kind hearts. The good die young, and nice guys don't win ball games.
Yes, Dad.
Well, I think you'd better hurry if you want to catch your train. I've got to get over to the office.
Yes, Dad.
Yes, Miss Mitchell? All right, put him through. Hello, Gallagher? This is Clark here.
Clark, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Listen, Clark, have you foreclosed on that mortgage yet?
My son is on his way up to Hudsonville right now.
Then I can go ahead and sign the contract today?
Yes, I advise you to go ahead and sign the contract.
Oh, what's the name of that stuff again?
silicon phosphate chloride.
Well, I can't say it and I can't spell it. But I know it's going to be worth more than radium in about a year. You know how much that stuff is going to be worth an ounce as soon as the Food and Drug Bureau puts its seal of approval on it?
You've already explained its value to me, Mr. Gallagher.
Okay, then I can go sign that contract today.
Yes. In fact, according to my watch, my son should be just about now registering in a Hudsonville hotel.
I'm sure you'll like your room very much, Mr.
Clark.
Oh.
Well, I won't go up and look at it now. You just have the suitcase put in the broom, will you?
Sure thing, Mr.
Clark.
Oh.
Now, I wonder if you could tell me how to get to 26 Spindle Hill Road.
26 Spindle Hill Road. That's old Mrs. Hudson.
Yeah.
Old Mrs. Hudson. Her grandfather founded this town. That's why it's called Hudsonville. Because the name was Hudson. See, Hudsonville, he was a nutty old coot.
Nutty?
Oh, sure. He came here prospecting for oil. He dug a well and struck one of those underground springs, began bottling the stuff and selling it as a patent medicine. He claimed it made you feel better. It sure did. I took a swig of one of his bottles when I was a kid. 3 parts gin, I think. Woo-hoo. You should have seen me staggering around kindergarten. This federal government finally made him stop for violating the law.
The Food and Drug Act?
Nope. Prohibition. He died in 1919. He was 103 years old at the time. Kind of makes you stop and think, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, old Mrs. Hudson. Nice old lady. Screwier than her grandfather.
Screwy?
She keeps mice all over the place.
What do you mean she keeps mice all over the place?
Well, some people keep cats and dogs. Well, old Mrs. Hudson, she keeps mice.
You mean trained mice?
No, mice. Mice, regular mice. The kind of mice she put out mouse traps for. She got little holes bored along on the floor and the wall. She puts out cheese for the mice to eat. She's a little screwy, you know what I mean?
Regular mice?
Oh, yeah. She's got some names for them, too. Soames.
Soams?
Yeah, Soames. That's the one in her bedroom. The one named after her husband. Then there's, let's see. There's Everett, Langston. Some names for mice, huh?
Yes.
Eccentric, to say the least. Eccentric. Listen, she's nuttier than a fruitcake. Listen, it's harmless. Lonely old widow. Let her have her fun, huh?
Widow?
Yeah, lives there all alone with Soames and the other mice and an orphan girl named, what's her name? Naomi. Yeah, a nice girl. Works down at the railroad restaurant.
Orphan?
Yep.
Widow and orphan. It's going to have to foreclose a mortgage on a widow and an orphan on Christmas Eve?
You talking to me, Mr.
Scrooge. George P. Scrooge. Mrs. Jane Hudson, 26 Spindle Hill Road, Hudsonville, New York.
Yes.
Mrs. Hudson, my name is Clark. I'm here to...
Please come in, Mr. Clark. It's cold. Standing out here in the open doorway. Now you follow me right down this hall here to the kitchen. It's the warmest room in the house, and I'm putting up some tea. Would you like some tea, Mr. Clark? Now, watch how you step by that door sill there, Mr. Clark. There's a lot of little pieces of cheese there on the floor. Do you see?
Yes, I do.
I know you'll think this very strange of me, but I put that cheese there for the mice, and I must warn you not to be alarmed if suddenly one of them scampers out and drags the cheese away. Would you like some tea, Mr. Clark?
No.
Of course, they might not come out because...
They?
The mice.
Oh.
Because you're a strange presence, and they might be frightened of you. They're not frightened of me anymore. I have one in my bedroom who positively, indolently, takes his time crossing the room. Named that one Soames. That was my husband's name.
No, please, Mrs. Hudson, I wish you weren't so hospitable to me.
I have so very few callers during the year, Mr. Clark, and it is a real treat for me to have tea with someone. So please.
The truth of the matter, Mrs. Hudson, I've come here on a very unpleasant business, and it embarrasses me to be treated so kindly.
I am not very well, and I get out of the house very little. Mr. Clark, so please do sit down and have tea and talk for a little while with me.
Of course, Mrs. Hudson.
Oh, that's very nice of you, Mr. Clark. Now you drink your tea before it gets cold. Do you want cream or lemon?
No, just plain is fine.
Now, I'll pour myself a cup. Oh, there goes one now.
What?
mice. You missed him. They're very quick. I'm very attached to my mice, Mr. Clark. You can become attached to very strange things when you're lonely.
Yes, I suppose so, Mrs. Hudson.
Now, you told me you had some unpleasant business for me. Would you like to tell me about it? Has something happened to my son, Michael?
No, Mrs. Hudson.
Or Naomi?
No, it's not that. It's nothing at all, Mrs. Hudson. Drink your tea, Mrs. Hudson, before it gets cold. Hello, Dad.
Yes?
This is George. I'm calling from a drugstore here in Hudsonville. Can you hear me?
Yes. What is it?
Listen, Dad, I've just been to see that old lady, Mrs. Hudson.
Yes?
Dad, she's an old widow. She lives there with an orphan. A widow and an orphan, Dad. She's a lonely old lady, Dad. She spends all of her time feeding Swiss cheese to mice.
Did you serve the papers on her?
What?
Did you serve the papers on her?
I'm trying to explain to you.
George,
Yes, Dad.
I want those papers served by tonight. Do you hear me?
Yes, Dad.
And it is absolutely essential to the interests of our client that those papers be served before tonight. And in the office of Montgomery and Clark, that means it shall be done. You understand me?
Yes, Dad.
Now, what did you say about Swiss cheese?
Oh, nothing, Dad.
Yes.
Mrs. Jane Hudson, 26 Spindle Hill Road.
Why, Mr. Clark, please come in.
Mrs. Hudson, I'm an attorney authorized to serve these foreclosure papers on you. Unless you can remit $16,000 to my client by January 6, 1950, you must vacate the premises.
I'm afraid I don't understand.
There's nothing to understand. Your mortgage is being foreclosed.
But I haven't got $16,000. I haven't got any money at all.
Mrs. Hudson,
You can't be serious, Mr. Clark.
Mrs. Hudson,
What shall I do? I have no money. Where shall I go? Oh, dear. Oh, dear.
you'd better get inside, Mrs. Hudson. There's quite a draft blowing on you with the door open. Goodbye, Mrs. Hudson. Merry Christmas. Yeah, sure. Merry Christmas. Give me another cup of coffee.
Draw one.
When did you say the next train leaves for New York?
About 5 minutes.
Well, I did it. I foreclosed on the mortgage. I've reduced an old widow to tears. Maybe there's a couple of orphan children I can evict from a tenement.
Here's your coffee.
Thanks.
What are you mumbling to yourself about? Did you have a fight with your girl?
I don't have a girl. I have a father.
My father died when I was 1 year old.
Boy, you're lucky, let me tell you.
My mother died when I was 2.
I just foreclosed a mortgage on an old widow. You know that?
Oh, really?
Local to White Plains, Scarsdale, Larchmont, and 125th Street and Grand Central Station at the platform now.
Well, I guess I better be going.
Excuse me. Hello? Railroad Restaurant. Oh, hello, Mrs. Wallander. What is it?
How much do I owe you? I had 6 cups of coffee.
Excuse me a minute. Mrs. Wallander, yeah. That's 60 cents.
Well, I'll see you.
Okay, Mrs. Wallander. Now, what did you say was wrong with Mrs. Hudson? What mortgage? Who's going to foreclose the mortgage? Well, what did he look like? Mrs. Wallander, you tell Mrs. Hudson I'll be home in a couple minutes. Hey, where did he go?
Give me another cup of coffee.
What happened? Did you miss your train?
I wanted to miss my train. I don't know what we can do to save the old homestead, but I just can't go off leaving that old lady crying like that. Come on, let's go.
Do you want that coffee?
No, but give me a Swiss cheese sandwich. We'll bring something home for Soames.
Now, Mrs. Hudson, you just lie still in bed there. Mr. Clark doesn't mind if you stay in bed, do you, Mr. Clark?
No, you just stay in bed, Mrs. Hudson. Now, Mrs. Hudson, we can save your land, but we just...
Naomi, could you put this cheese there by Soames' hole?
Of course, Mrs. Hudson.
Mrs. Hudson, stop worrying about Soames. You've got to worry about yourself. Now, I want you to concentrate.
Yes, Mr. Clark.
Now, we can save your land and your home if we could transfer the title, the ownership, to somebody else who would be very difficult to locate. Because in order to foreclose a mortgage, you have to serve papers on the owner of the land.
You do understand that, don't you, Mrs. Hudson?
Yes, of course I do, Naomi.
Now, in your particular case, Mrs. Hudson, if they can't find the owner of the land before January 6th, then they forfeit all their rights to foreclose on your land. So you see, if you have to think of somebody whom it would be impossible to locate before January 6th.
How about Michael, Mrs. Hudson?
I would rather the mortgage be foreclosed and sign this land over to my son.
Mrs. Hudson, I'm sure you have a very good reason for feeling about your son the way you do, but he might just be the fella who we want to transfer the title to.
Oh, there he goes.
Who?
Soames. He just fetched his cheese.
Soames? Soames. Well, why not?
Did you say something, Mr. Clark?
Mrs. Hudson, why don't you sign your land over to Soames?
Why, I don't know. It's...
To a mouse?
Why not? People have legally deeded property to cats and dogs. Why not to a mouse?
It seems a little bizarre to me, Mr. Clark.
Mrs. Hudson, there's no reason in the world why you can't transfer property to a pet. Believe me, in the world of business, stranger things have happened than that. I knew a man once transferred the title of his land to Adolf Hitler in order to avoid foreclosure. There. That's even a better precedent. There's a case of a man transferring title to a rat. A rat. Ah, that's sort of a joke. See, pretty good, huh? Well, I think I could argue this case very effectively in court.
I think it's a very funny idea.
I think it's a corker.
Well,
We'll draw the paper up right now. Then you call a notary to witness your signature. Give Soames another piece of cheese. He's a landowner.
Oh, this is wonderful.
And a Merry Christmas to us one and all, Tiny Tim.
You're a very clever young man, Mr. Clark.
Well, I must tell you, I think this is going to work.
I think you're wonderful.
You do?
Your father must be very proud of you, Mr. Clark.
I never thought of that. Well, an hour later, and everything was all over with. The notary came, and Mrs. Hudson signed the transfer of title, and the notary went off to file it with the county clerk. And I went downstairs with Naomi to have a cup of coffee.
Honestly, I don't know why you're so gloomy. You just did a very nice and noble thing. You should be very proud of yourself.
Yeah.
You're another Sidney Carton.
Sidney Carton got his head chopped off at the end of the book.
Nobody's going to chop your head off.
That's what you think. Well, I guess I ought to call my father.
The phone's right out there in the hall.
I know the phone's right out there in the hall, but what am I going to tell my father? I'm going to tell him Mrs. Hudson transferred the title to a mouse. My father's not the sort of chap who would find that amusing. Then my father's going to check on the date of the transfer, and then he's going to figure out that I was up here a good couple of hours before the title was transferred. Then he's going to put 2 and 2 together, and then you know what?
What?
I'm going to get my head chopped off like Sidney Carton.
Doesn't your father know it's Christmas?
To my father, Christmas is nothing but a legal holiday. My father says the only way to get ahead in this world is to be mean and ruthless.
Your father sounds like it's better to be an orphan.
Actually, he's not as bad as I make out. He's just a little distorted about things like Christmas. Say, what's Mrs. Hudson hate her son Michael for?
Oh, well, he was the kind of guy you either hate or love.
And she hates him, huh?
Yeah.
How do you feel about him?
I'm married to him, you know?
No, I didn't know.
Yes, I'm married to him. He was kind of wild, and after 4 years in an orphan asylum, I guess you fall in love with anything wild. I don't know. He was the first guy I knew. I guess you never get over the first guy. Well, listen, don't get me talking about him.
Would you like to?
I haven't talked about him for a long time. I have a funny feeling I'll start crying if I do. He was pretty mean, George. He didn't leave me very nice things to remember, but there was a couple of nice times, and those are the times that make me cry.
Well, go ahead and tell me. Well, if he disappeared 8 years ago, Naomi, you're not really married to him anymore. 7 years, that's desertion, and that's New York state law.
Well, I certainly poured out my heart to you, didn't I?
Are you embarrassed?
No, I'm not. There's something awfully decent about you, George. You better go call your father, George. It's almost noon.
Yeah,
George?
yeah,
George, 7 years. Is that the law?
that's the law. That's it. Well, I guess I better go call my father.
Hello? Hello?
Hello? Hello, Dad? Can you hear me? This is George.
Yeah, I can hear you.
Oh.
Is everything all right?
Well, there's sort of a snag I've run across.
What snag?
Mrs. Hudson has transferred title to somebody else.
When did that happen? There was no record of transfer on her mortgage when I sent you up there this morning.
Well, it must have happened very recently.
Sounds pretty fishy to me. Sounds like she's got a shady lawyer. Who's her lawyer?
What?
I said, who's her lawyer? What'd you say?
Listen, Dad, I'm not very good at this kind of deception. I'm the shady lawyer.
What?
I said I'm the one who advised her to transfer the title.
What did you say?
I said, Dad, it's Christmas for Pete's sake.
What are you talking about?
Dad, it's an old widow, 60 years old, an orphan girl. You could have heard the hard life she's had.
A 60-year-old orphan girl? What are you gibbering about?
I'm trying to tell you, I just didn't have the heart to foreclose.
Did you say you were the lawyer who advised her to transfer this title?
Yes, Dad. Dad? Dad, you still on?
George,
Yes, Dad.
I'm taking the next train up to Hudsonville. I should be there by 1 o'clock. I want you to meet me at the station.
Yes, Dad.
I'll never find
excuse
what
me.
my wife's looking for.
Excuse me, I was in front of
What
you.
say that butter was again?
I just went to get a pound of butter.
Well, Naomi, I got the butter and the eggs, the bread, the napkins, the potatoes, the onions, the pepper, the...
George, my goodness, you don't have to carry all those bundles. Why don't you get one of those little wire carts out there? Haven't you ever shopped in a supermarket before?
What little wire carts? You mean this little baby carriage here?
That's not a baby carriage. That's a shopping cart.
This one squeaks.
Can you reach up and get the bag of flour for me, George?
Oh, I feel like a husband.
How is it you're not married, George?
Nobody ever asked me.
You're supposed to do the asking, George.
Okay, will you marry me?
That isn't funny.
I don't think I meant it to be funny.
George, you better get down to the station. It's after 1 o'clock, and your father must be waiting on you.
I'm not going down to meet my father. He'll make me spend the rest of this afternoon with him. I was kind of working up to suggesting that I spend the rest of the afternoon with you.
What do you feel like doing?
Walk, talk. It's a nice day. What do you feel like doing?
Walk, talk, sounds all right to me.
I'm going to tell you something.
What?
Of course, I'm not very experienced at this sort of thing, but
What sort of thing, George?
I really have very meager precedent to base this decision on. But from all the evidence, I think I'm in love with you.
George, I'm going to run home and get rid of these bundles, and
Yeah, and I'll run down to the hotel and get showered and shaved, and
I'll meet you right here in front of the supermarket at 2 o'clock.
it's a date.
Mrs. Hudson, please open the door. I have my arms filled with bundles. Hello, Mrs. Hudson. We've got everything. I'm going to bake a cake tonight. I bought a bag of flour. Is something wrong, Mrs. Hudson? You look pale.
Naomi, Michael's here.
Where is he?
He's upstairs in his old room.
Michael, can I come in? Michael?
Come in. Come in. I'm shaving. Who is that? Naomi?
Yes.
Well, sit down on the bed. I'll be right out.
Why did you come back? We had forgotten all about you. We had just about gotten to the point where we could think of you without our hearts aching. We were just beginning to enjoy ourselves, Mrs. Hudson and me. What do you want of us?
I need money.
We haven't gotten any money.
You got more than I got.
I have about $200 in the bank. If we give it to you, will you go away?
Sure.
How have you been?
Fine. Hand me that bathrobe out on the chair, Naomi.
Here.
All right, thank you. I'll be out in a minute. Well, hello, Naomi.
Hello, Michael.
How long has it been? 8 years? Did you ever think of me, Naomi?
How can I think of anything else? Oh, Michael. Michael.
Hello, desk clerk.
Oh, just a minute. Mr. Scrooge.
Give me my key.
Here you are, Mr. Scrooge.
Hello, George.
Hello, Dad. How did you know I was here?
There's only one hotel in town.
Well, Dad, I want you to be the first to know. I'm in love.
Well, George, I want you to be the first to know. You're fired.
Well, I consider that a fair trade.
Where's all the papers on this woman?
There's my briefcase right over there on the table. You don't mind if I wash up while you're going over those papers, do you?
Who'd she transfer this title to?
What'd you say, Dad?
I said, who'd she transfer the title to?
Soames.
Soames? Soames who?
Soames. Just plain Soames. Like Garbo. One name, Dad. Excuse me, but you're sitting on my suitcase.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I want to put on a new shirt. I got a date with this girl, Dad. She's wonderful. Kind-hearted, sweet-natured. You'd hate her.
Who's this Soames?
Dad, I got a good shock for you, so I want you to be get a good hold on the bed, and so you won't fall over and hit the floor. This Soames, Dad, is a mouse.
What do you mean?
A mouse, Dad. A little gray mouse. I don't know how you can foreclose on Soames unless you can talk some cat into serving the subpoena.
George, boy, are you serious?
You bet your life I'm serious. I think it's legal.
I think it's fraudulent and a deceitful practice, and you may very well find yourself up before the Bar Association tomorrow morning.
Tomorrow's Christmas,
George.
which I might add is a legal holiday.
George, I don't like this petulant rebellion of yours.
Dad, I got another shock for you. I happen to think that nice guys win ball games and the good live as long as they can and as they care to, and the way to get ahead in this world is to be decent, considerate of other people, and understanding.
George, sit down.
I'm sitting down, Dad, but I want you to know the only reason I'm doing it is to have to change my socks.
George, boy, I'm sorry I raised my voice to you.
That's okay, Dad.
I believe that's the first time I ever raised my voice to you.
Yes, I think that's true, Dad.
You seem to be in a very cavalier frame of mind, George. There's nothing to be cavalier about. You've put me in a devil of a fry. A devil of a fry. Really, George, a mouse?
The comedy of it appeals to you then.
It has its charm. But I can't see what you hope to achieve by it. I shall have the woman declared insane.
She's not insane. She's lonely.
A literary distinction. I'll have a psychiatrist up here from New York in about an hour.
The trouble with you, Dad, is you've been foreclosing mortgages too long. You've forgotten your law. You file suit against this woman's insanity, and I'll appeal it. I don't care if you bring Sigmund Freud up here from New York. I'll appeal it. I'll appeal it in the Court of Appeals, and then I'll appeal it in the Appellate Division, and then I'll appeal it in the Circuit Court of Appeals, and then I'll appeal it in the United States Supreme Court. And by the time I finish appealing it, either you'll be dead, or Mrs. Hudson will be dead, or the mouse will be dead.
Good boy, good. No corpus delicti.
And another thing, you can't declare this woman insane without having her committed by a member of her immediate family, and the only living member of her immediate family disappeared 8 years ago and hasn't been heard of since. What are you fighting so hard over this lousy 20 acres for anyway, Dad?
Well, it's in the interest of my client that this mortgage be foreclosed before tonight, and...
Yes, I know.
In the offices of Montgomery and Clark.
It shall be done. I know.
Yes.
Well, I ain't going to let you do it.
George!
What?
George, listen, I'll give you $10,000 to drop this whole case.
$10,000?
Yes.
It's a lousy 20 acres and a beat-up old house with a lot of mice in it. It's got 2 mortgages on it. What is it, oil? This isn't oil country.
All right, George, listen to me. My client is a very large drug concern. There happens to be a mineral spring on this land. Is something the matter, George?
Not that underground gin.
Whatever it is. The Federal Bureau of Drugs and Pharmaceuticals has been conducting exhaustive experiments on this liquid, and it contains silicon phosphate chloride, a rather unusual compound which, in its distilled state, is the most beneficial form of anesthetic ever discovered.
Yeah, even in its undistilled state, I hear it packs up quite a wallop.
George, my client is probably at this moment signing a contract with a large drug distribution agency, and he's doing so on my advice. Unless that land is legally his by tonight, he will have committed to a fraudulent contract, and Montgomery and Clark will have been guilty of advising a client falsely. I will pay you $10,000 to keep Montgomery and Clark's name clean.
You're a pretty clever old fox. Do you know that, Dad?
Really?
You knew just where to hit me, in my kind heart. I never thought I would live to see the day where you could make me feel sorry for you, but it seems I have lived to see the day.
Well, George, what do you say?
I just want you to know that you are asking me for my mercy and goodwill, something you said never existed.
Now, I am not asking for your mercy. I'm paying you $10,000 for it.
I don't want your $10,000.
George, I can get you disbarred for any number of things you've already done today. I can cut you off without a penny and see to it that you don't work in New York again. And I'm offering you $10,000.
Dad, I got a date at 2 o'clock and I'm going to be late.
George!
Hello? Hello?
Hello?
Hello? Who's this, Mrs. Hudson?
Yes?
This is Mr. Clark. I've been calling you all afternoon. Where's everybody been?
Dear Mr. Clark. Dear Mr. Clark.
What's wrong, Mrs. Hudson?
My son Michael has come home.
What?
He wanted money, and we went down to the bank, and Naomi drew out all her savings and gave it to him, and then they went away.
Well, where's Naomi?
I'm afraid she's gone with him. Mr. Clark, she's going to go away with him. They're down at the station now, Mr. Clark. Go find her, Mr. Clark. They're at the station. Go to her. Plead with her. Tell her not to go with him. He's not good. He's not good. He's mean.
The mean will inherit the earth, Mrs. Hudson, and the good die young. This is a dog-eat-dog world, and the road to failure is paved with kind hearts.
Mr. Clark! Mr. Clark!
Dad.
George, there's a psychiatrist on his way up from New York right now, and I've been drawing up this warrant of incompetence for Mrs. Hudson. You can make this all very easy for me, George, and that $10,000 is still an offer.
You got a customer. I think I can take you to Mrs. Hudson's son, Michael.
Will he commit his mother to an institution?
From what I heard of him, he'd commit himself for $10. He's probably the meanest man in the world, excepting for you, Dad, and me.
That's my boy.
That's my dad. That's the girl over there, Dad.
Ah, the rather pretty brunette girl, George?
And the fellow with her, I suppose, must be Michael. Look, Dad, I'd rather not see the girl right now. Would you mind making the appointment with Michael Hudson yourself?
No, not at all, George.
I'll meet you back at the hotel.
All right, George. Excuse me, are you Michael Hudson?
Why?
I'm an attorney. My name is Clark of Montgomery and Clark of New York City.
You're George's father.
Yes. Mr. Hudson, I'd like to talk to you about a matter that will bring you in a good sum of money.
How much?
Michael, the train's going to be here in about 10 minutes.
He said a good sum of money, Naomi. What's a good sum of money to you, Mr. Clark?
I might leave that definition to you, Mr. Hudson.
What do I have to do?
Well, why don't we go up to my hotel room so that we can talk?
Michael,
Naomi, don't be so nervous. He said he's going to leave the definition of a good sum of money up to me. All right, Mr. Clark.
I think I've explained the matter to Mr. Hudson quite clearly, don't you, George?
Yes, very clearly.
It is clear, isn't it, Mr. Hudson?
Yeah. All I got to do is go with you down to that courthouse and swear my old lady's nuts. Is that right?
Yes. George, stop pacing around like that. What is the matter with you?
I feel lousy.
And now we've reached the point where I'm supposed to define what a good sum of money is.
How much do you want?
$10,000.
I'll give you 1,000.
Cash.
I haven't got any cash on me.
I want cash.
Answer that phone, George.
Yes, Dad.
And then call Mr. Williams at the office. Tell him to bring $1,000 in bills up here immediately.
Hello? Hello? This is George Clark. Oh, send him up. Dad,
Yes, George.
the psychiatrist is on his way up.
Well, Mr. Clark,
Yes, doctor?
from what you and Mr. Hudson have told me, I would say casually that the woman is philizoic. The patient being governed by a dominant compulsion of withdrawal, seeking their psychic perspective in a pathologically self-created world. In short, the familiar Freudian concept we call neurotisch. Do you know German? Unfortunate. So we have images usually drawn from deep associations with long repressed dominant aggressive instincts, thus channeled into unnatural passages of behavior. Is that all clear to you, Mr. Clark?
Yes.
It is?
Yes.
Well, explain it to me. I got lost somewhere in the middle there and have no idea what I was talking about.
It means that this woman is legally insane and incompetent to take care of her own affairs.
Oh,
It's getting late, doctor. I think we'd better get over to examine the old lady.
well, I'll have to ask Mr. Hudson here some more questions about his mother.
All right, but hurry up. George? George, where are you going?
I'm going downstairs to the cocktail lounge. I feel lousy.
Hello, George.
Oh, hello, Naomi.
What does your father want with Michael?
He wants him to swear out a warrant of incompetency, declaring that his mother is insane and that therefore any contract she has signed is null and void.
And Michael must have thought that was a dandy idea, didn't he?
Yeah.
How much is he getting for it?
$1,000. Well, what are you looking at me for? He's your husband, not mine.
What do you mean, my husband?
Well, I can only assume that
He left me 8 years ago. That's desertion. That's the New York state law, isn't it?
Naomi,
Well, isn't it New York state law? You told me it was.
it's New York state law, all right. If for a period of 7 years or more,
You mean, well, what are we standing here for? Let's go.
don't you understand, Mrs. Hudson? They're going to try and prove you're insane.
I don't believe I'm insane. Do you, Naomi?
No, of course we don't, Mrs. Hudson.
Then how do they intend to prove it?
Well, quite frankly, Mrs. Hudson, to anybody just walking in here cold, all these mice and, well, it would seem eccentric.
But I do like mice.
I think they're here. A taxi just pulled up in front of the house.
This is the only way I can help you. This is not just a legal issue of insanity. Your son, Michael, is going to commit you, and that means I'll have to fight this case in surrogate's court instead of civil court, which means that it's much too complicated to explain now, Mrs. Hudson, but please do what I tell you.
I'm sure you're making too much out of this psychiatrist. I'm sure that he will see that this is just a little eccentricity of an old lonely woman.
They're here.
Now, Mrs. Hudson,
Yes, Doctor?
you say you have even given some of these mice names?
The ones I recognize.
They have individual personalities for you.
Yes, they are quite different if you watch them long enough. The one right here in this room is a sort of casual fellow. He's my favorite. This one, sometimes when I'm lying in bed, I sometimes think I hear him moving about on the floor, watching me, trying to figure me out. Just as you're doing right now, Doctor.
Yes, and you think of these mice almost as people?
I think more highly of them than I do of most people I know.
You think more highly of them than of people?
Yes, I've been watching my mice for many years, and in all that time, I do not believe I've ever seen one mouse swindle another one,
Oh,
or
yes, of course, Mrs. Hudson, but they're...
get drunk and smash windows like those terrible young men down the block.
Mrs. Hudson...
And mice do not persecute smaller mice, Doctor. I do not believe I've ever seen one mouse beat his wife or rob a bank. And of course, I'm not sure, Doctor, but I do not think that mice have a need for psychiatrist mice or lawyer mice or...
well...
Indeed, Doctor. Many days after I've read my paper and listened to my radio, I feel very relieved to sit quietly in my chair and enjoy the rather untroubled society of these lower animals.
Huh. Yes. I see. Well, let's go on.
Well, Dad,
What time is it, George?
it's almost 4 o'clock. Oh, Dad, I have to tell you something.
That doctor's taking a long time in there. It's not going to leave me very long to get that warrant sworn out before the court closes. Wait a minute. I think I hear him coming. Well, doctor?
Mr. Clark, there's a Freudian concept called near infidelism in the ebb stage, which I myself dispute, which causifies a certain phase of philozoic, which usually manifests itself in the love image of small animals, this sublimatory transference being related to the outer hunger need of manic diffusion.
And what precisely does that mean?
Mr. Clark, we should all be as insane as that woman.
What are you talking about?
I'll be very honest with you, Mr. Clark. Sometimes I myself don't know what I'm talking about, but I can tell you quite categorically that after listening all day long, 6 days a week, to the horrible emotional problems of our time, it was a pleasure to spend an hour with Mrs. Hudson.
I'm not paying you a fat fee to come all the way up from New York to enjoy this woman's company.
You are paying me a fat fee to determine her sanity. I'm telling you, she's sane.
Well, I guess I can find a quack who will sign a certificate for that woman.
There's
There.
the phone, Dad.
That must be Williams calling from the hotel.
Hey, Dad, there's something I have to tell you.
Well, goodbye, Mr. Clark. I'll send you a bill in the morning.
Oh, Mr. Clark, there's a long-distance phone call for you from a Mr. Gallagher.
Gallagher? Oh, all right. I'm coming down. And, young lady, you tell your husband to get his coat on. We're going right down to the courthouse anyway.
My husband's gone. Didn't George tell you?
He wouldn't give me the chance.
What do you mean he's gone?
He just went out, didn't he, George?
He sure did.
Where did he go?
Where did he say he was going, Naomi?
He didn't say.
Well, what happened?
I told him if he went down to the courthouse and swore out a warrant for Mrs. Hudson, I'd go down with him and swear out a warrant for him in the next office.
What sort of a warrant could you swear out?
For desertion.
And for non-support, Dad. Do you remember, Dad, how his eyes lit up when you mentioned the word cash to him? Well, at the sound of the word non-support...
She can't sue him for being separated for 8 years. It's not legal.
Oh, we knew that, but he didn't.
Mr. Clark, you'd better answer your phone call.
All right, give me the phone. Hello, Gallagher?
Hello? Clark?
Yes.
Clark, can you hear me?
Yes, I'm afraid I can, Mr. Gallagher.
I've been trying to get a hold of you all afternoon. I just got this number from your office. Clark, have you foreclosed on that mortgage yet? Well, hey, drop the whole thing, will you, Clark? I've been advised not to go through with this foreclosure.
You've been advised? By another lawyer?
No, by my psychoanalyst.
By your what?
Oh, I've been suffering from very severe headaches these last few years, and my psychoanalyst says they're due to guilt complexes. And I was sitting here in the Blackstone Hotel thinking about this mortgage, and after all, it is Christmas, and I'm going to die some poor woman of her home before I knew it, I'd worked myself into another severe headache. So I called my analyst, and he advised me to drop the whole thing. I hope I haven't caused you too much inconvenience, Clark.
No, not at all. The truth of the matter is I'm rather glad you made this decision. Well, a Merry Christmas to you, Mr. Gallagher.
A Merry Christmas to you, Clark.
Oh, George! George!
Yes, Dad.
Well, George, do you or do you not intend to marry this young woman here?
Well, what do you say, Naomi?
Well, in the words of Montgomery and Clark,
It shall be done.
You have been listening to an Apples of Gold radio adaptation of The Meanest Man on Earth, featuring Ken Guthrie as George Clark and Matthew Imsh as George's father. Also heard were Cheryl Webb as Naomi, Claire Butler Bass as Mrs. Jane Hudson, Marshall Valentine as Michael Hudson, and Kenny Bass as Mr. Gallagher, the desk clerk, and the psychiatrist. Apples of Gold is directed by Danny Webb and produced by Rodney Pell. This is Rodney Pell speaking. Now here is director Danny Webb with his closing devotional.
A farce is defined as comedy that seeks to entertain an audience through situations that are highly exaggerated, extravagant, ridiculous, absurd, and improbable. That describes my life at times, I think. The Apples of Gold broadcast of the farce, The Meanest Man in the World, hopefully made you smile. However, the plot itself was sad. A lonely widow with pet mice as her only companions being evicted on Christmas Eve, and a young woman who had been orphaned as a child, deserted by a ne'er-do-well husband, and an aspiring altruistic lawyer dominated by a demanding father who wants to mold his son into a pitiless attorney like himself is not, to quote Rick Blaine, the stuff that dreams are made of. The story ends well, though, as George Clark, the young attorney, demonstrated some ingenuity in his efforts that saved the day. To me, the prevalent theme in the story was loneliness. It made me think of a song that a dear friend of mine, Alan Bay, sings. It goes, "Every day they pass me by, I can see it in their eyes. Empty people filled with care, headed who knows where. On they go through private pain, living fear to fear. Laughter hides their silent cries, only Jesus hears." Loneliness is more keenly felt at Christmas time, I think, because at Christmas time, more than any other, want is keenly felt and abundance rejoices. May I suggest that you take time from your hectic schedule and visit a person you know to be lonely? And when you go, take Jesus with you. You can't go wrong by presenting the one who himself suffered loneliness to the highest degree. You recall on the cross his cry, my God, why hast thou forsaken me?" And if you are lonely, let me offer this advice. Don't sit there like the proverbial knot on a log. Get up and do something. Not to plead, but to encourage. Invite others into your life, and not merely to hear your lamentations, but to offer some Christmas cheer. Help someone for a change, even if you don't feel like it. You will be encouraged by encouraging others. I know it may be hard and will take effort. Thinking about someone else other than yourself may only be a distant memory, or perhaps you have always been self-centered. Here's a thought. Maybe there's a person with whom you are at odds. Ask God for direction and attempt to reconcile. Even if you fail, God will honor the attempt, I believe. Another part of the song my friend sings is, people need the Lord. At the end of broken dreams, he's the open door. The point? Getting alone to pray and reading your Bible will help with your loneliness. If you are too busy to daily pray and read your Bible, you are either lazy or simply too busy. With that being said, there can be sorrow in solitude that is crippling. If this is you, my question is, why sit there until you die? Ask God for help, then step out in faith believing and do something. What do you have to lose except your loneliness?